here this evening, but nonetheless, we're going to be talking today about sins of the tongue, and there's all kinds of aspects. Matter of fact, when I started putting this together, I didn't realize at first just how much in the Bible is said about the tongue, whether it be from Proverbs, from the wisdom, Psalms, or from James, or from Christ himself. There's a multitude of verses that cover different aspects of the tongue or of things that men spew out of their mouths, and that's what we'll be looking at here through this lesson. Is we'll be covering, we'll look at what God's concern of the tongue. We'll be looking at a couple of the Ten Commandments, and then we'll look at a principle that James puts forth, or that think twice before speaking. Then we'll do the compare the tongue as a thermometer and a thermostat, and then probably come back tonight and we'll cover what I call the 7 sins of the tongues, or 7 categories of sin that the tongue that are committed by the tongue. So we'll begin with looking at God's concern for the tongue. Like I say, God put forth emphasis on the sins of speech. Matter of fact, 2 of the 10 Commandments refer to sins of the tongue. We see in Exodus 27, it says, "You shall not take the name of God, your Lord. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." And then he also pointed out that you shall not bear false witness against your fellow mankind or your fellow brother. So early on in the institution in the Bible, we can see that God had already expressed concern over the matters of the tongue. Solomon tells us 7 things that God hates, and actually 3 of them from his wisdom are concerning the tongue. And if you look over there in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 9 through 19, says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provide her supplies in the summer, and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and you need like an armed man. A worthless man, a wicked man, walks with a perverse mouth. He winks with his eyes and shuffles his feet. He points with his fingers. Perversity is in his heart. He devises evil continually. He sows discord. Therefore his calamity shall come suddenly. Suddenly he shall be broken without remedy. These 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him: a proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that desires wicked plans, feet that are swift in running to evil, a false witness who speaks lies, and one who sows discord among brethren. I guess I should have only read 12 through 19. But anyways, we see there that Solomon points out that God despises a lying tongue, again, and a one who bears false witnesses and lies about a fellow man, and then also one who sows discord among brethren. So like I say, out of the seven things that God is pointed out as despising or things that he hates, 3 of them are matters of the tongue. Christ also gave warnings of the tongue. Over there in Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37, he says, "But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of the judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." So that should set a precedence right there for us to realize that we need to be careful about what we say, because we are going to be held accountable for all those things that we've allowed to come out of our mouth on the day of judgment. So and also remember, it's sometimes not what we say vocally, but also what we say inwardly in our heart. Those things will be held accountable too. So we really think to control what our speech is, or what our inner vocals are towards our fellow man, and towards those things that are spiritual in nature. So that leads me to the first principle that we want to look at, and it's to think twice before speaking. James writes, "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear and slow to speak." And this is where we want to take this idea to think twice before speaking. I came from in the Air Force. We worked on the aircraft, and we would trim metal and repair the aircraft when it became damaged. And our motto was measure twice, cut once, because as you can imagine, many young airmen get out there and they hurry up and try to get done real quickly, and they don't go about it the way they ought to, and they end up cutting a part that's too short or too small, and then if it's not within tolerance, then you have to scrap that part and start all over. So we, like I say, we adopted that idea of measure twice, cut once, to cut down on the amount of mistakes that we make. And I think that also carries forward into our everyday communications with fellow men, or fellow mankind and fellow brethren, that we ought to think twice before what we say, because sometimes in the heat of passion we can let things spew out of our mouth that ought not to come. Many things are open by mistake. This is one man's quoting. He says, "Many things are open by mistake, but none so frequently as one's mouth." And so I think that echoes. I know we often say, I put my foot in my mouth. I've done that many times myself. If I would have just thought twice before letting it be opening up, I probably would have saved myself a lot of heartache. Someone also once wrote a little poem. He says, it goes, "A wise old owl lived in an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we all be like that bird?" And again, I think that's a little bit of man's wisdom there, that we probably should fashion ourselves after the wise old owl, and realize that it's amazing when you stop. They say men are fixers by trade, so I usually jump in and want to fix something before understanding everything. And I can't tell you how many times I've jumped in to fix something to just realize that, if I just would have stopped, listened, and let them continue to share what was going on in their particular lives, you often realize that people will fix their own problems as they're explaining to you. And so again, that gives credence to that principle. If we would think twice before speaking, same way with jumping in on solving people's problems, is if we would just stop and hesitate and let them finish out their conversation or what they're explaining to you. A lot of times what you'll see is people, as they think through their process of explaining to you, they solve their own problems, and it's quite it's a good tool for leadership. But nonetheless, I think we need to think before we speak, and that's the principle we want to take away from this aspect here. Also, words tell the man. We also, we all have a dialect, if you will, or an accent. Often people can tell if you're from the South, or if you're from Boston. You might say you have a ka, something like that. But often one's dialect or their accent often will give away their origins of where they're from. Even here in Ohio, I think Ohio has 3 distinct accents. You got the one in Cleveland, you got one here in middle Ohio, and then you got down around the Cincinnati, Kentucky border. It's a little bit more of a drawn-out southern twang to it. And we even see that principle in the Bible. Peter was betrayed by his speech. Look over there at Matthew 26, verse 73. It says, "A little later, those who stood by came and said to Peter, 'Suddenly, you also are one of them. Your speech betrays you.'" So evidently, the way he spoke, Peter was from up around the Sea of Galilee, and the way he spoke gave away that he was not of those people that was around them at the time of the betrayal of Christ. So just as an accent indicates one's origins, so speech betrays the condition of one's heart. And that's the principle I want you to take away with this, is that if you stop and listen to an individual, you can often understand or come to realize just how spiritual that individual is. A spiritual man will probably say things like, well, if the Lord would have it to be, or and would not curse or use foul language, or would not condemn his fellow man, or would not be judgmental. Often, you can usually tell, especially when you're out in the world, if somebody is a worldly person or if they're a spiritual person, just by what the things that they say. So we need to understand too that when we're out in the world, that we also are individuals, and we can either become like the world, or we can be the Christians that we are and speak that way we ought to. And consider this principle that Christ put forth over there in Matthew 12, verse 24, where he says, "Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of abundance of your heart the mouth speaks." So again, he was condemning the Pharisees there, but out of the abundance of your heart the mouth speaks. So in other words, he was saying, what's in your heart is what you're spewing out, and we need to realize that too, that if we are talking in ways that we ought not to, we ought to examine inwardly and realize what's going on with our heart. Let's now look at some wisdom of Solomon. Like I say, Proverbs is full of all kinds of little parables here dealing with wisdom of speech. And the first one we'll look at is Proverbs 10:19, where it says, "In the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." Kind of like that wise old owl. "He who has knowledge spares his words." So again, this is getting to, one who has wisdom in their life would spare their words and not necessarily divulge or share everything that they have. We also see in Ecclesiastes 5:3 that a fool's voice is known by many words. So again, I'm not saying that we need to be short and succinct in what we say, but again, knowledge is equated to sparing words and a few words, whereas a fool is known by many words. So it would give credence that often probably those that are busybodies are probably sharing too much information, are probably saying things that they ought not to be said, whereas a wise person would probably just keep those things to themselves. So with that, let's go into our next point, and that's we'll look at the tongue and look at it as a thermometer and a thermostat. So just to refresh everybody, probably everybody realizes this, but a thermometer records the temperature, and a thermostat controls the temperature. So I believe that we'll look at some verses here, is that the tongue combines both aspects. And we'll begin by looking at James chapter 3, our proof text there in verses 2 and 4. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths, and they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Like also at ships, although they are large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by many small rudders without the wherever the pilot desires. So here we see this aspect of where it's the tongue that's the principle there is that the tongue is in control of the things that are going on, if you will. So speech exposes that condition of heart. That's what we looked at. Swearing discloses a profane heart. This is the aspect of the thermometer. It also, impure stories discloses a filthy heart. A murmuring discloses a thankless heart. And criticism often discloses a jealous heart. So again, if we just listen to what people have to say, or we stop and realize what we're saying, especially when we get down into this area, this murmuring criticism, we ought to be asking ourselves, am I thankless and am I jealous of my fellow brethren? If that's the case, maybe you ought to be adjusting your thermometer and controlling that heart a little bit better. Now let's look at the tongue, or that's the thermometer aspect. Now let's look at the thermostat, if you will. The tongue not only measures moral condition, but it also a determining instrument. That's what we saw there in verses 3 and 4 that we read. A bit determines the direction and the speed of the horse. Just like a thermostat on the wall determines when the furnace comes on and at what temperature it's set. So that's and then also we had the aspect of the rudder steers a small rudder steers a giant ship. Same way with the heart. The tongue is definitely a thermostat, because the tongue can lower the temperature of one's pride, one's temperate, one's jealousy, and spite that one might have. Again, these are things that can be controlled with the tongue. You can let those things be spewing out of your mouth, which you ought not be, or you can temper them as we ought to as Christians. And then we'll look at some other sins of the tongue also that weren't covered within these things. But realize that these things we can divulge. These are all things that are divulged through the tongue if we allow the tongue to be unbridled, as James forewarned us. So I'm going to close the lesson at this point, and just we'll let that kind of think on those things throughout the remainder of the day, and then when we come back tonight, we'll look at the seven sins of the tongue, and we'll see how this idea of this thermostat and this temperature plays out throughout these sins of the tongue. So now we want to extend the invitation. We're here this morning. We're gathered together. We realize that God's done His part. We only have to do what there's been put forth for us to do. If you're not a child of God and you like to obey the gospel, all things are prepared, all things are ready. If you're already that child of God, perhaps there's something on your mind, perhaps there's something you want to share with the congregation, or perhaps you want the prayers of the congregation. Whatever that case may be, as we stand and sing, let your will be known.
Zion's call sweetly rings over land and sea, bidding us look to realms above. Welcome light from the throne shines for you and me. Let us listen to the call of love. Zion's call is ringing, coming from the throne above. While we hear it ringing, let us heed the call of love. On the road to the goal, burdens we must bear, but we have help from realms above. We receive courage here when we kneel in prayer. Let us listen to the call of love. Zion's call is ringing, coming from the throne above. While we hear it ringing, let us heed the call of love. While we tarry below